Welcome back to the Covenant Cast. My name is Steven, and we got a very special show for you today. Zach and I are interviewing Andrew Parks. He's the man behind Quixotic Games, and they have done a ton of design work. Most notably, for us, I guess, the Nightmare Before Christmas trading card game, one of the unknown until we played it classics of our channel and a holiday favorite for us. And, we were struck by this game. We played it. We enjoyed it well more than we thought we would. And then, of all people, Andrew Parks, designer of the game, reaches out in our YouTube comments, says, "Hey, I'm the designer of this. I'm glad you guys dug it." That started our relationship, and we've been able to get a hold of Andrew and connect and put on this interview. And honestly, some of the most fascinating stuff about the industry and the history of so many of our favorite games comes from what Andrew says in this interview. So we hope you really dig it. We certainly found it super valuable for our own perspective. And without further ado, Andrew Parks, Quixotic Games. Let's do it. All right, well, let's just get things kicked off here. So we're talking to Andrew Parks today, and Andrew is, my gosh, what an interesting connection that we've all made. So we started playing the Nightmare Before Christmas TCG somewhat randomly.
Yeah, I mean, not that. We did the throwback series,
Yes.
and it was around Halloween or Christmas. I don't remember which. And played the. I've been wanting to play the game forever,
Yes.
like just for a long time, and we liked it so much that we've kind of made it an annual tradition so far. Since playing it the first time, we just keep playing it.
And then everybody was really into it. And then we get this comment, and Bryce, our content manager, he was, kind of reading through all the comments. We get a comment from Andrew that's like, "Hey, I'm the designer or one of the designers on Nightmare Before Christmas TCG. What's up?" And it was like, oh, well, this is an opportunity. So we're talking to Andrew Parks, who is one of the designers of Nightmare Before Christmas TCG, and of course, many other games that you'll likely know about. And Andrew, thanks so much for being here. We can't wait to talk to you, and just want to start with, how are things going in 2023 for you as a game designer?
They're going great. First of all, thank you guys so much for having me here. And it's so exciting to know that you guys enjoy the game so much. We still get emails from people regularly who are just starting the game, because there's a whole community for what they call dead CCGs, as I'm sure you're aware.
Oh, yeah.
I still had a couple of promo cards that I send out to people sometimes, so I'm running low on those. But people still contact me, especially in October. They want to know if, hey, there's something on Board Game Geek where you said you'd give out a promo card for free? And I was like, "Just send me your address, no problem." So it's kind of exciting. So in 2023, I'm really sort of engrossed in a project I've been working on for 15 years. I won't get too much into it because I know we were going to talk about Nightmare first, but I'm working on the Tales of the Arthurian Knights, and off and on, I've worked on it for 15 years, and we're getting to the very, very end of the project. We're in the final editing stages right now, and I feel so out of the loop in the gaming world because I mentioned to you guys earlier before we came on that I feel like a hermit, which is appropriate because in the Arthurian legends, the knights would often wander around on horseback and come up upon a hermit. That would be me sitting there writing the story because I've been so kind of like removed from the rest of my life working on this game.
Well, man, I have so many questions. We have some interesting context. You said for about 15 years. So we started Covenant a little over 16 years ago. Wow. So in my head, the idea of we've been working on Covenant for a very long time, it feels like. And so you've been working on that game for almost as long as we've been building our entire company, which is crazy. I can't wait to see it. So honestly, I have a lot of questions for you. And I'm really curious just to hear your story because we've been playing all these throwback games. And in 2005, when Nightmare came out, I would have been 17. And I had no idea about this game, never heard of it back then, and was not really paying. I mean, I played card games as a teenager, but I was playing like the one game that I played at the time. And so I'm just curious to hear a little bit from you on your perspective. How in the world did you get involved in the design of this game? And just what were things like at that time? I honestly, this whole game is sort of a miracle to me. The idea of a TCG for Nightmare Before Christmas sounds crazy. So, anyways, I'm just curious, how did you get roped up in this, and what was it like back then?
Well, first of all, everyone thought it was crazy when it came out. Like, wait, this movie at the time was 12 years old. So people are like, why are you making a trading card game, which is all about the new edgy stuff, about a children's movie that came out 12 years earlier? And and in particular, at this time in 2005 was sort of, we were over the peak of the golden era of trading card games. Things were crashing fast because people realized, hey, you know what? It cost me hundreds or thousands of dollars to play one of these games. I can only play one, but there's a new one coming out every 2 weeks. This was, the very definition of market crash. So all collectible games, right, like within a year or two of this game coming out, collapsed, except for Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, and a handful of others. But there were hundreds of them at this time. So how did I get involved in this craziness? Well, I was a stay-at-home dad, first of all, and my daughter Sarah was born in 1997, and my daughter Julia was born in 2001. They're now, 26 and 22. They still help me with playtesting, of course. But while I was a stay-at-home dad, I started pursuing. I was an English professor, adjunct, and then my wife and I decided she's an actuary, I'm an adjunct English professor. Who's going to keep going to work in that situation? The actuary. We wanted someone to stay home with their daughters. So I started shopping around game ideas starting in '98. Took me 5 years to get my first game published, and that was Ideology: The War of Ideas with Zev Schlesinger at Z-Man Games. That was his first board game, actually. He had done card games before that. This is his first actual board game. And so he and I then worked on another couple of projects together. And then he became affiliated with NECA, the National Entertainment Collectibles Association. And they are world-renowned for all of their collectibles. They make the really high-end stuff. Like the 300 movie came out, they had the actual swords, like really, they have the action figures with like 12 points of articulation, and stuff is hand painted. I mean, just they were the primo, but they had all these board game rights that they weren't using because they kind of were packaged in with all of the other things that they had rights to. So Zev got to know the president of NECA, which, by the way, is still a very strong player in the industry because NECA eventually bought Wizkids. So everything comes full circle because I'm working on Tales of the Arthurian Knights with Wizkids, where Zev now works. Zev is no longer at Z-Man Games, the company that he started. He's now at Wizkids. So it all comes back around again, right? So anyway, going back into the past, Zev was talking to NECA about games that they could make to use up these licenses. And he had a lot of designers that he worked with. And so he assigned different people. I think at the time, Eric Lang, who's of course one of the greatest designers of all time. He wasn't quite as big then, so he did a game, I think, based on Sin City. And there were different games that were being made, no trading card games. And they said, let's make a trading card game, because trading card games are so big right now, about The Nightmare Before Christmas. I know a guy who's into trading card games, and he's a young designer. Let me see if he's interested. And I loved trading card games, and I absolutely adored The Nightmare Before Christmas. And so I said, yes, no matter what, I'll make it happen. We're going to do this. So he asked me, I came in for a meeting, and then I got started. So Zev is the co-designer on the game. So he and I sat down and talked about some ideas, but then he was busy with his own company. So he let me sort of take the reins. And then he would come in every once in a while and take a look and give some suggestions and so on. So I had a whole bunch of people that helped me design games all the time. So we brought them in. All of them were trading card game players. And one of the first things we said was, there's so many trading card games out there. What is going to make this one different? And at the time, it was just the very beginning of Euro and American style games starting to merge. they were always so separate. There was the American style game or Ameritrash style game, and the Euro game. And so they were so different from each other. And we said, we've been playing this game San Juan all the time. It's about building, not destroying. What can we do that makes a game like building? And so we said, well, for Nightmare Before Christmas, they're building up towards their version of Christmas. Let's have you build your Halloween town and create things, literally creations that would become these presents that you would give. So you can interact with each other directly if you want to, if you include those cards. So you'll notice that Oogie Boogie has a lot of cards like Sound of Rolling Dice and stuff where he goes in and directly attacks you. But you don't need to play with those cards. You can just indirectly interact, and that's where the whole Pumpkin King mechanic came in, to make sure that even though you're building your Halloween town and I'm building my Halloween town, there's always going to be something that connects us and which affects the two of us based upon who has the most creations, who has the fewest cards, and so on. And so that's kind of how we got started making the game, to make it a different kind of game that fused these sort of Euro and American style mechanisms. And just to throw something else in there, what's interesting is that not only were trading card games starting to plummet in 2005, but so were Euro games. The actual game company, Euro Games, went bankrupt either that year or I think maybe in 2006. That was because every single Euro game at the time was, I have these colored cubes and I convert them to these colored cubes. Then I convert them to these colored cubes and then I convert them to victory points. And they were getting more and more expensive because of the quality of production. And so people are like, I don't need this game about pyramids. I have the same exact game about animals. It's the same exact game, just the theme is different and the theme seems to be pasted on. So over time, after this very difficult time in the game industry, which then following that was the whole recession. And so everything, the video game industry came apart, everything fell apart, and then everything started to come together. And the game that's probably best known for bringing Euro and American style mechanisms together is Dominion, which came out in 2008. And that began what I think has continued to be the golden age of tabletop games. Because of that, wow, there's so much we can do if we keep these different, very flavorful elements and streamlined elements and mix them together. So this was coming out a few years before that, unfortunately. But we did get to do an expansion for it and a tournament kit and everything. And we loved working on this game so much. But arguably, this was in sort of that early era of people trying to combine what they loved best about these two different worlds.
Well, Andrew, given your telling of it, then I would have to say that you guys are responsible for the golden age of tabletop games.
Not really
clearly
take credit for that.
If
only more people had played the game, maybe. We had a lot of players, but not enough.
The experiences that we've had with the game have been so fun and so positive. You can feel that kind of early heartbeat of something's happening with this kind of a title. I wanted to ask you, you said you were really, really love Nightmare Before Christmas as an IP. What is it about that particular IP and that particular story that you felt reverberated with you as somebody who wanted to then come in and design this kind of game?
Well, the movie itself, when it came out, was a real phenomenon. So I'm a bit older than you. And if you guys are the same age, then I'm a bit older than both of you.
Yeah, that's right.
So when Nightmare Before Christmas came out, I was 24. And there had just been a lot of disappointment in any kind of arena of kids' movies or kids' shows. Everything that came out in the 70s and 80s was cheap. And I'm really generalizing here. Okay, let me just say that first. But certainly cartoons and so on, they were cheap. They were extremely watered down. Nothing of consequence ever occurred in any of these things. Even the G.I. Joe cartoon from the 80s, nobody ever died. These guys are literally shooting M16s at each other. Anytime a plane blew up, someone would jump out with a parachute, always, in every shot. And so everything was just so watered down. And the 90s were the beginning of that, let's actually make things and pretend that kids have brains and give them real stories. And so that's about the time that the Batman animated series came out, right around that same time. So what a brilliant show, and so unlike everything that had come before. I mean, Batman takes his fist and he punched people in the face. Up until that time, Batman would defeat people by throwing a tire over them so they couldn't move their arms anymore, or tying them up with the Batarang. No one ever, there was no such thing as fantasy violence. So Nightmare Before Christmas came around that same time, and it was so shocking in its complexity. And I think it was just so well done, and the characters were so rich. So many characters that I didn't really pay attention to when I watched the movie the first couple times, but I'd watched it at least a dozen times by 2004 when we started working on the game. And as we're working on the game, of course, we became the masters of all these characters. We knew all the nuances of who Corpse Kid was and who the parents were and who was friends with. We realized that Mummy Boy was friends with Corpse Kid because they would hang out together in some of the scenes. And we actually NECA had already done a trading card set. So they had named a lot of these characters, but they had never named the elves. So we had the privilege to go in when we did Christmastown and give all those elves names and personalities. Like the guy who was the insomniac, only because, Jack wakes him up in the middle of sleeping. So we determined he was an insomniac. So we got to do all that really fun stuff. But the reason why I was so attached to that IP was because when it first came out, it was at the beginning of a new era. I used to tell my daughters all the time, I'm not going to be one of those grown-ups who tells you, things were so much better in my day. I would tell them all the time, everything sucked for kids in my day. You guys are so lucky. I would have killed to have had these shows that you guys are watching, And so anyway, so I put my age out there for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 90s, and looking back, the 90s, and I thought it was just
fortunate, weren't we?
Yeah, I thought this is what happened, but the more I talk to people older than me, it's not true. I think the 90s and 2000s was actually a pretty incredible time to be a kid. And for a lot of other, I was thinking about the X-Men animated series, same kind of reality, right? And beyond everything.
Biker Mice from Mars, let's not forget.
Yeah, we even got like Freakazoid and
yeah.
Dexter's. No, I'm just kidding. But really though, there's some really incredible content back then.
That Batman the animated series, though. I mean, that
So
intro comes in, and that you're on a different level.
And they had this huge. If you've ever had interviews with these guys, I mean, not you've had personally, but if you've heard interviews with these guys, they had like a full orchestra, and those create Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, Alan Burnett, I think, are their three names. And why the DC cinematic universe has not tapped these gentlemen to do it. They would have all their stories and characters and everything figured out for them because these guys were such geniuses. The other big thing, by the way, that was huge in the 70s and 80s was the cute character syndrome. Like Batman used to run around with this guy named Batmite in the early cartoons. And he was just this little screw up who floated around. He looked like Mistleplick, but in a Batman costume. And he would always say, I was just trying to help. It would just screw everything up. And there was a cool Spider-Man animated series in the 80s, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. The animation was actually pretty good, but they had this dog named Miss Lion who had a little pink bow in her hair, and she would always screw up their adventures. So anyway, that's my rant about my upbringing.
Yeah, well, so another question I had for you, just trying to go back. I'm curious and you may not have been privy to these conversations, but effectively for Nightmare, what success might even look like? Because the thing that puzzles me beyond the fact that all the stuff you mentioned about it being a kid's movie from 12 years ago, why are we making a CCG? But again, it's a movie. And so when I think of TCG, it's like really expansive, and like you need the ability to make lots of content over time, 2 or 3 sets a year. So I don't know. What was the goal, right? Like what, I'm trying to connect the dots. I love Nightmare Before Christmas as a kid. It was a big movie for me when it came out when I was young, right? So I get the appeal to make a game about it. Like a board game makes total sense to me.
Because you guys did make a board game, right? After
they made a board game before I was involved.
Okay.
Got you. Like a board game makes a ton of sense. But a TCG, like it just seems crazy on the surface.
What was the whiteboard like?
It really is. It really is insane. For me, there's no way I was going to say no. There was just no way I was going to make it work no matter what, because I love trading card games. I hadn't designed one. I had done a lot of my work during that 5 years that I was trying to get my game published. I did a lot of play testing for trade. I did play testing for Star Wars collectible card game, and especially the Lord of the Rings trading card game, which was the second one. Not the Middle Earth, the Wizards, which was designed by great Coleman Charlton, who's a very close personal friend of mine still. I go visit him all the time. Not that one. I worked on the next one, the Lord of the Rings trading card game.
Yeah.
So I had done that work. I was like, there's so much I want to do that's not being done. And I love Nightmare Before Christmas. So I said, I'm going to make this happen. So we did, and we knew we'd do Christmas Town. We had another expansion that I had an idea for that we actually advertised, as you may know, in one of the promo cards called The Real World. And in The Real World was going to have locations from the real world. And you were going to, now that all these creations that you built, you were going to deliver them. Just like Jack does towards the end of the film. I don't know where we would have gone from there. But their thought was, we have this, trading card games are hot, and their appeal was going to be to non-gamers. So it didn't matter to them that there were going to be 2 expansions every year, because they knew there were so many Nightmare Before Christmas fans that their goal was just to appeal to them. And so therefore, that's why they were going to make it work, because they were just going to keep selling that set to new players all the time who were fans of the game. If we had expansions, bonus. But then what happened was the company was coming to me and they were like, we need to make this more appealing to gamers. What can we do? So that's when we created the tournament kit, and we started creating a tournament program, and it was working. People were playing, and so on and so forth. People loved the game, universally loved the game. I would say that one of my failures as a designer on that game, though, was, as simple as it may appear to a gamer, it wasn't really simple to a non-gamer. So the core audience that the game was originally being made towards, probably it wasn't going to get picked up. But you look at that rule book, that's a gamer's rule book. That is not a 2-page, hi, flip your cards out and everybody cheers. So that's, that was not that kind of a game. So the sacrifice that we made in making it a good game was that it wasn't necessarily a great game for non-gamers. And that's on me completely. That's me kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. So I think in the end, they probably printed too many. And so they just couldn't sustain it anymore for the amount of money that got put into it. I know they sold a lot, but just not enough. And that's why ultimately they pulled the plug on it. But they're great people over there at NECA. I loved working with them. I worked on them for a lot of games. This was the first game I worked on them for. Even before Wizkids bought them, I got to work on 300. I got to work on Gremlins. I got to work on Office Space. I really loved working with NECA. And so when NECA bought Wizkids, I thought, I'm out of a job. Because, I also got to do the Harry Potter Hogwarts game. With them, which is only the second Harry Potter game at that time that had come out. And so I was like, I'm out of a job. They've got Wizkids now. They don't need a contractor like me, because I wasn't an employee. I was just a contractor. I've always been that. I've never worked full-time for a game company. And so what happened was Wizkids contacted me a couple years after that, and after they were purchased by NECA, and said, hey, we might be doing an expansion to that Harry Potter game. Can you do it? I was like, yeah, of course. Because the game was only based on the movie. So when it came out, it only was the first 5 movies had come out. This is in 2008. And it turns out they didn't end up doing it because there's not a lot that happens in the last 2 movies in Hogwarts, especially the last movie. I should say the last 2 movies that are based on the 7th book. And our game was all about being in an actual school. But, they were banished from the school. So they didn't end up doing it, but I then had that point of contact. And then they said to me, hey, if you're available to do other stuff, we're busy working on our things. We have some things here and there that we can throw your way. And Hunger Games and other games came out, and I started working on them with them more and more and more complex games. I did a Justice League game. I've done so many games for Wizkids now. So I've really had that relationship with Wizkids with NECA and Wizkids combined for about 19 years now.
Wow.
So, but I always loved working with them, and I always wanted to make them happy, because it was such a privilege for me to work on all of these different licenses.
Well, yeah. So let's rewind it a little bit, because you said 3 of the most important words in tabletop gaming, which is Middle-earth CCG, Star Wars CCG, and Lord of the Rings TCG. 3, arguably, I would say, having now thrown back to them. I think we did like 20 Lord of the Rings TCG videos. Yeah. Truly remarkable games that really set a tone, and I think set a different path for Magic was kind of going down one path, and these games to me represent a bit of a different path for a trading card game to go down. But with that in mind, so how did you decide to become a game designer? Were you a Magic player? Did you discover, these older games as a kid and you've always been interested in board games, that kind of thing? And then with that, where did this Quixotic Games come from? I know that your website is Quixotic Games. There's a lot of designers involved. What is that company, and how did you guys kind of get spun up in all of this?
I always loved games since I was a kid. And I made my first game design when I was like 6 or 7. My dad did the prototype for me because I did the prototype, it was illegible because I was, was not necessarily had neat handwriting, whatever. My dad helped me make the game. It was called Challenge the Wizard. It was just a roll and move with lots of decks of cards because I like the idea of lots of decks of cards. Then when I got a bit older, I made another game and I became very good friends with someone who was a colleague of mine. We've known each other for almost 40 years now, Chris Guild. He was the co-designer with me on Star Trek Attack Wing, and he's designed a bunch of games on his own, still makes games with me. And when we met, I was 15, he was 18, so he's a lot older, by comparison. And he prototyped one of my games, and so we started playing a lot of games, and we were in a play together. We were in Godspell. He was Jesus, and I was Judas. That's how we met each other, became best friends. So you can't make this stuff up. So anyway, we started playing tons of games. We started playing Dungeons and Dragons together. We played Talisman when it first came out. We adored that game. Beautiful. We have played Talisman possibly more than any other Americans ever. Thousands of times we played that game, which has so much luck to it. You think of it now, you're like, what the hell were we thinking? We loved this game. So I was always designing games, and it's funny, I was on the path to becoming an English professor, which probably wouldn't have worked out so well because my friends who were also English professors have experienced the reality of being an English professor, which is, it's very hard to get tenure. And if a lot of people, I work as an adjunct now as a game designer, I love it. But who knows if I would have done anything but adjuncting, which is very low pay and everything else. So anyway, but when I was thinking of my dream of the future, I wanted to be a writer one day. I wanted to do all these things. I said, and then one day when I retire and I can do whatever I want to do, I'm going to make board games. And they say that you should always ask a young person what they would do if they didn't have to make money. And that's the thing that they would love to do most. And that's what that was to me, the ultimate final step was making games. So when flash forward to 1997, when my daughter is born and we decide I'm going to be a stay-at-home dad, in 1998, I said, I'm going to just start making games because why not? I got, I can't just sit here taking care of my daughter. I have to do other things too. I was doing a little web design on the side in the early days of HTML, like coding in HTML. And I made this game called Ring of Doom in the Lord of the Rings license. I had been playing Star Wars collectible card game in tournaments, loved Star Wars collectible card game, had played a lot of the Lord of the Ring games that at the time had been made by Iron Crown Enterprises. And so at the time I didn't realize, only one person has the rights to Lord of the Rings. Let me contact those guys and show them my game, which is extremely naive. So I sent an email to Iron Crown Enterprises. Donald Dennis responds to the email, who's someone who's very big in the industry still. He's a big podcaster. You may be familiar with Onboard Games. He does still to this day. He sends me an email and says, well, why don't you just come down and show it to us? I had no idea how rare this was. So I go down to Charlottesville, Virginia, which is this huge game design hub. I meet the entire cast and crew of Iron Crown Enterprises, including Coleman Charlton, who had designed all the games that I had at the time. I actually had used artwork from the Middle-earth collectible card game in my prototype. Showed it to these guys, had no idea who they were. And they have become a part of my life ever since. In 1998, they've all become a part of my life. Coleman Charlton and I are still, he's a mentor to me. We were very close. I go down to see him whenever I can down in Charlottesville still. He's retired now. Jason Hawkins, who was one of the art directors for Middle-earth collectible card game, got me started. He got me started with Parthenon and other games that we worked on together. And so I just befriended these folks, and they wanted to do the Ring of Doom game, But because of the movies that came out, Iron Crown Enterprises lost the rights to Lord of the Rings. Those movies came out right about that time period. So then they were going to do another game with me that I designed using those same mechanisms, and then they ended up going at it. They ended up folding and became all those guys became very heavily involved with Mayfair Games. And even after Mayfair Games folded, those guys, Coleman Charlton and Pete Fenlon, who was the president of Iron Crown Enterprises and became the president of and CEO of Mayfair Games, is now this CEO of Catan Studios, which is in charge of Settlers of Catan in English-speaking Settlers of Catan. And Catan Studios is owned by Asmodee. So everything ends up in Asmodee. So anyway, I those guys all got me started, but I still never had a game design for 5 years. And that was when Zev Schlesinger, I was introduced to him by Ed Beer Jr., who was an artist for Magic the Gathering. He ended up being a vendor at the New Jersey Renaissance Festival, which my family owned at the time. He was a vendor selling his artwork. So Ed said to me, "Oh, what's this game you're working on?" I was working on a game. That based on the Renaissance Festival that I owned. And so then I showed this game to Zev, and this became Camelot Legends, my second game that was ever designed. So networking is everything. So I got to know Zev. Zev did Ideology before he did Camelot Legends. Then we did Camelot Legends. And then we got involved with NECA through Zev. And then Zev, eventually I did games with Zev. Then Zev sold his company. Then Zev left his company and became the board game director at Wizkids, which he still is today. So he said, "Andrew, I see you're doing some stuff for Wizkids. Want to keep doing things with me here?" I said, "Of course." And so we've been doing games together now. Wizkids NECA, Zev and I, because Zev is no longer at Z-Man Games. So I got to see all that fun. One day I got to write a memoir, right? So
this is insane. You're like the through line of every name that we've ever heard in this industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's such a fascinating life story, honestly, because you start out as a professor, and I think a lot of people, especially in the 90s, right? Like I don't think a lot of people were dreaming. It's more common now to be like, I want to be a game designer, or I want to publish my own games, or I want to, tabletop is so much bigger than it was in 1995, as an example. And even then, Magic was kind of going crazy, but there's only so many spots on that bus. But you start professor, and then a life event happens. And one of the things I keep hearing you say, which I think is just an incredible character point for you, and also a good lesson for all of us, which is like, even you made the game, you took your shot, right? And you didn't really realize how rare the opportunity of who you were meeting and who you were getting to pitch a game to and what that was. And it doesn't work out. But your kind of reaction to doors closing in your life is very positive, it seems like. And I just want to commend you for that, because you're
well, I was very fortunate to meet those people.
Yeah, and that's a really good attitude to have. But I think a lot of times when something doesn't work out in life how we want it to, you can be disappointed, and you can you can just kind of crumble.
Game design is not for me.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, well, like that didn't work out. So, and then you have your chance encounter with Ed Beard, which then connects you down the line, right? Which is crazy. And like Ed, we're familiar with now because he's doing some of the art for Sorcery, which is another game that we're getting into. So it's just really crazy, like hearing, like we weren't there for it, right? Like we started Covenant in 2007.
Yeah.
Which is not that far. Crazily, it's not that far from the Nightmare timeframe, but
that was right in the middle of all the changes in the industry. Mm-hmm. Everything was changing in 2007.
Yeah, which, looking back, it's like that's a really fortunate time to get involved in something. Like there's opportunity, and it's before it is what it is. Like I think today it's so much harder to get started as a game designer or doing anything that we're doing, because it's just a very different environment. So on that note, one question I had for you, like it's just amazing to hear it, right?
It's so cool to talk to you.
But you said you've been a hermit more recently, but I'm kind of curious, just looking back, if going back to 95, 97, 2000, is there anything about the industry that happened exactly like you thought it would, or the opposite? Like a left turn was taken somewhere along the way, and things really today are just way different than you expected them to be?
Definitely. First, I just wanted to say that there were a lot of times that I almost gave up. I'm not inhuman. I felt that disappointment a lot of times and was like, I'm just not cut out for this. Even after my first games were published, I received, I'm proud of Ideology and Camelot Legends and Parthenon, but all three of those games had major issues with them. And they received a lot of criticism, and it's difficult to understand what that's like when you have no idea what it means to be on an international stage thrust suddenly and have people kind of ripping you apart. I mean, I learned so much from those three designs, and I still love them and still play them, but I had to learn how to accept that criticism. Now I'm just like, yeah, just let me have it. Just let me have it, because it makes me so much better as a designer. Anytime someone criticizes me now, it's a strength. But at the time, I was just like, whoa, I don't think I can handle this. This is really crazy. And so I did almost give up many times, and I had a lot of disappointments. I don't mind sharing one little anecdote where I really was about to throw the towel in. Was after I'd done all of that play testing for Decipher. And remember, they did Lord of the Rings trading card game, Star Wars trading card game, Star Trek trading card game. And then I even was a product champion, I think they called it, for Lord of the Rings trading card game, where I went out and promoted the game. They then had a game design position come up, and I didn't think I had a strong chance of getting it, but I knew everyone because I'd been with them at the conventions, working, demoing everything. I certainly had designed a lot of games, which is one of the biggest things. If you're not published, at least be constantly designing. Had shown them to them, had done all this work for them, and they didn't even give me an interview.
Wow.
And I felt so heartbroken, because the guy who was doing, I don't mind saying his name now because he's a nice guy and everything, but this is a guy named Tim Ellington. And he tried to make me feel better about it. And I was just like, you didn't even give me an interview? Like, I've done all this work for you. You've seen my ambitions and all these other things. Now, I've seen Tim since then. We've had a good laugh about it. But at the time, I was like, I'm done. I'm just going to take care of my kids and whatever. And then something, you get pulled into things. Then you're like, oh, well, there's this opportunity. I guess I could do this. And Zev says, well, they're doing 300 the board game. I was like, oh man, I always loved the comic books. I got to do that. And then so I got back into it. But yeah, that was tough, because I'm sorry, that just to separate that from 300 the board game, that was before I was published, the Decipher thing. So that was before I met Zev. So I guess I had sort of given up at one point, and the event that was actually a real turning point to get me back in. I had no games published, and I was at a Decipher Con because they used to do their own convention. And even though I had met Zev, things didn't initially turn out well enough for us to do Camelot Legends, because remember, Ed Beard introduced me to him. And I was showing this. I had made Ideology with no intention of having it published. I designed it because 9/11 happened, and I didn't understand what led to 9/11. So I said, I'm going to make this game as an exercise. So at DecipherCon, when I wasn't helping promote the games for Decipher, I was playing this game with some people, and who walks over but Tom Slazewski, who at the time was the editor-in-chief of Inquest magazine. And I had been introduced to Tom because he took a look at the Camelot game that we had designed and gave some feedback on it. And Tom said, what's this? I said, oh, hey, Tom, it's nice to see you again, whatever. This is just something I made. We're playing with my friends. He goes, yeah, but this is kind of unusual. You've got this, somebody's communism, someone's Islamic fundamentalism. Like, what the hell is going on over here? So I showed him the game, talked to him about it. Then I got a call from Zev a week later, and he said, Tom told me you were working on this other game. What is this game? I said, oh, it's not really a game. It's kind of, he goes, come to my house and show this to me. I want to see this game. And that's how my first game got published. So I kind of had given up. So I don't want to take credit for being like, just, I can stand anything. It did, there was something came together there for me, a real blessing that happened. Once again, just this weird connection.
Well, I think that's really just a strong, I love that you were making it not even to make a product. And I think that's just you see that all the time, right? When you see people that do truly get somewhere or succeed at something, just this obsession with the craft, right? like you've been designing games since you were a young kid, and you just were prepared. I say this all the time about big tournaments, but I think it's true in this case too. You have to be very good at what you do. You have to be very prepared, and you have to get a little bit lucky. And like the only reason that the luck happened for you in these moments, these chance encounters in these moments, is because you were ready for it, right? Like you designed this whole game, which eventually gets you in Zev's house, showing him this game, which gets you to your first published game. It's just incredible. It's what a wild ride. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Real blessing, yeah. I feel really blessed in that way. So getting to your question about the industry changing, the first time I ever went to I used to go to local game conventions. The first time I went to a big game convention was in 2000. So this is 3 years before I was published, before I met Zev or anything like that. It was amazing how the industry was different in 2000, even from a couple years later. To give you a sense of where things were, everything was either trading card games or role-playing games. That was it. There were very few other tabletop games. Twilight Imperium, I think, had its second edition was out, and it wasn't that big a deal at the time. I think it was still just a prototype. There was only one game with miniatures, one, and it was so unusual. It was such a unicorn because no one was doing it. It was Glenn Drover's first game, War: Age of Imperialism, which had the most beautiful miniatures, certainly even at the time. But I mean, for now, even they were beautiful. The game itself had a lot of problems, but at the time, that was the only game. It was a prototype. Everyone was oohing and eyeing over it, but it was the only one. There were a few non-collectible card games, very few. And this is when I was trying to pitch my Camelot game at the time. So there were tons of role-playing games, and D&D 3.0 had come out, and their goal, no doubt at the time, was to put everyone out of business because everybody had a different system. Everyone. And you had your first D20 games just starting to come out at that time. But their goal was definitely to make it so that you could not make a role-playing game without it being a D20 game. And that was definitely, you could see that beginning right there. There were so many role-playing games there that were not D20. And a year later, they were almost all D20 because of that system that they had created, which now, of course, has become so controversial. But that was just at the very early days of that. So I would say the biggest thing for me was I was always looking for non-collectible card games. Camelot Legends, at the time it was called Camelot Adventures, was the prototype. That was a non-collectible card game that used some of the complexity of collectible card games. And I really wanted that to be the thing. And it did become the thing more and more, but not for a long time. And also, miniature board games were not a thing at all. So the idea that this became Kickstarter and everything has all revolved around they were not a thing. Glenn Drover really was the one who got that ball going again. Because, you had Axis and Allies in the past and everything. But in that time, as I said, it was all collectible card games, role-playing games. That was Origins 2000.
Well, so with that in mind, I gotta ask you, so you've been going to conventions, you've, I assume, seen or been to local game stores and those kinds of things. You've seen the industry develop. It's now 2023. So in your mind, where are we now, and what are your thoughts about how things have changed, both positive and negative? I think for me, I have a little bit of a romantic thing about Middle-earth CCG and some of these older games having a soul or a passion behind them that feels a little more commercialized now with a lot of the things that we see, which makes sense. But I'm curious if you share that view and kind of what your general take is on where we are now and where we might be going.
So, by the way, Middle-earth the Wizards is still played by people. There's conventions throughout the world for it, and Coleman sometimes, when he's feeling up to it, goes out to them. There was one in Germany that he went to a few years ago. So that's pretty amazing. It's like an
game slaps, man.
It's like an entire convention devoted to that game, which is incredible. But I would say the only thing that's really disappointing for me, because I'm so excited about where the industry is right now in general. I love the games that are coming out. I'm a huge fan right now of Dune Imperium with all the expansions and everything. Love that game. And what a great hybrid of the worker placement and the deck building game. I'm a big deck building fan. Love deck building games. I would say the only thing that was disappointing to me is how Kickstarter and crowdfunding evolved. because, you can almost not see a way for it to have evolved differently. But when it began, it really was a way to introduce people who had been in my position in 1998 into the industry. And it very quickly evolved into, we're only going to back games that are done by people who have done games before. And then we're only going to do things where that person has done a lot of games, and therefore we know it's going to deliver because so many did not deliver. And then it's going to be, well, what am I going to get that's different than the retail product? And the only people who can really deliver that successfully are the big publishers again. Even to the point where myself, who's an established designer and have published a couple of games, when I did my last Kickstarter, it ended up succeeding, but nowhere near where I had hoped that it had. This was for Core Worlds Empires. And one of the biggest critiques of it had nothing to do with the gameplay of the Kickstarter itself, was that I didn't have enough animated GIFs on the Kickstarter page. We had done a beautiful movie, which apparently is no longer important. We had done a beautiful movie that really went in and showed all the mechanisms of the game. But because we didn't spend that time in the main body, because nobody watches the movie anymore, and didn't have those animated GIFs, we were told it was very amateurish. And by the time we added more stuff, it was too late. And I was like, wow, we have really gone so far from where we were that now it's how much, and it was literally, I was being told, you don't have enough bling, so therefore you must not care about the product. And there was, I considered, quite a bit of bling. There's a lot of images, a lot of discussion. The video is, you should watch it after this. It's a really fun video. The pieces get up and literally shoot lasers at each other and explode into fire. And it shows the gameplay, but it wasn't what they wanted in the main body. And I just feel bad that that's where that became, because I think there still needs to be something. I think we do have the Game Crafter, which I think does fill that niche really well. I do know some early designers who have used Game Crafter to get started. And so I'm happy with that. But I think that there needs to be a way for those new designers to get in and to be treated well, and to remove that gatekeeping, because that was really the promise of Kickstarter. And like, okay, maybe we didn't need to have someone say, I have an idea for a game and I've never made a game before. Please give me $20,000. I could see that not lasting forever. But someone who has made their entire prototype and made their rule book and has a decent game should have a shot in crowdfunding that they don't necessarily have most of the time now. And I think that's kind of sad. Now, that's the only sad thing. The good things are that we do have this really open space of design. And I think one of the biggest things that's different now in the design space from where it was in the 80s and 90s and even the aughts is that we are no longer a litigious industry. We were an industry at the time of, you used a mechanism that reminds me of one of my mechanisms. I'm going to sue you for that.
Wow.
And that really changed about the time that you guys started your company. I'll give you credit for it. But no, it really began with Rio Grande Games. They deserve the credit. Jay Tummelson deserves the credit, and Don and Mr. Vaccarino, because when they put out Dominion, other people immediately started coming out with trading card games, present company included, and they never said a word about it. I'm sorry, deck building games. I said trading card games. I meant deck building games. No one, other people, Arctic Scavengers came out right away. Ascension came out right away. We came out shortly after that in 2011. And they never said a word about anyone using those deck building games. And what a phenomenon that has been for our industry. Because forget deck building games, the games that use deck building like mechanisms have grown so much from this standing on the shoulders of giants, is the term that people have used. And we're standing on some very mighty giant shoulders that have allowed us to move forward with these things. The other person who deserves a lot of credit for this, because really, if you think about it, the only strikingly innovative mechanism that has come out since deck building games in 2008 is the legacy games that Rob Davio created.
Yeah, Rob Davio, yeah.
And now he's working for Hasbro at the time. And he was very clear that he didn't want that mechanism patented. And he wanted people to take that. And he actually helped the first few legacy games come out. He worked with them to help them do it right. So between legacy games and those deck building games, now who has the cojones to say, but my game is so original, how darest thou draw upon it? Because these guys came out with these games and encouraged other people to take those mechanisms. And I think that's the best part of game design right now, is that we all are in this environment now where people expect people to borrow, and people have drawn a little bit on some of my stuff too. And like, for example, with Core Worlds, one of the things we introduced was to the deck building genre was the idea of the progressive deck builder, that you have different decks that change as the game continues. Because like Thunderstone was very big at the time, and you had all the cards kind of mixed together. It's like, why am I encountering this stuff now? I'm not ready for it. So that gave us the idea to sort of create this game where it was sort of these progressive things. And we also were very big on letting people keep some of their cards and add hand management to deck building, so that you weren't always just dumping your hand, draw a new hand, dump your hand. So we added that, and I've seen that in some other games, and I'm like, yes, that's exciting. That's the world we live in now, and that is only going to make the industry grow. And if it ever goes back to those litigious days again, you're going to see the industry shrink.
That's a fascinating point to make. I hadn't even considered that that was a factor going on at that time, and how much of a kind of a yoke was taken off the neck of the industry by that, just like voluntarily not engaging in those kinds of practices. With that in mind, you know, now that you have that freedom, and now that game designers are free to kind of, you know, explore each other's concepts and improve, for you just as a person, do you think that game design is a process of constant refinement that will end up at some kind of perfect, you know, mountaintop of these genres, where this is the perfect deck building game, this is the perfect Euro game, and will it basically be done? Or like, are there an infinite amount of possibilities for tabletop game design in your mind? Because it is, you know, by its nature being physical, a limited medium. Does it have an end?
No, definitely not. First of all, people are not ubiquitous, right? Everybody likes something different. So I love a game that you may not like. It may be my favorite game. And I'm like, why isn't everybody else playing this game? This is amazing. So you've got all these different appeals. And I mean, look, as I said, two major innovative mechanisms in the past. And there's going to be a lot more. Each one adds to the toolkit of every designer. So, the culmination of, Dune Imperium is one of those games that's a really just, I don't know if you guys are into it or not. It is just a phenomenal game, and it combines so many different things. But then as a designer, I think, well, if I did that and I took it with a different thing, I could kind of add this element, or maybe add more. Because I think one of the biggest things that's happening now, and it's really moving slowly, but it's definitely industry is moving this direction, is the storytelling game, is the games that tell stories, emergent stories. For the longest time, the storytelling game was the game that gave you scenarios that were pre-written, like in Gloomhaven, #1 game in the world, right? So people love that. But I think what you're going to see more and more of is the emergent game, such that you, the player, will be experiencing things that the designer never experienced. This is certainly the thrust of Tales of the Arthurian Knights, is to make an emergent game experience. And now that you have this explosion of AI tools, I think you're going to see it even more. Like, I can see now, I mean, I'm a very pro AI person, and I know there's people all over the spectrum. But when I have time finishing this, one of the things I'm going to work on is, for fun, is creating some sort of adventure where the characters you meet do not have any script. All they have are motivations. Because when you play with something like ChatGPT, you know that you can give ChatGPT motivations and it will speak on its own. You can tell it exactly what it shouldn't say and what it should say. I did a whole ChatGPT thing, not to go on too much of a tangent, where I told ChatGPT to talk to me like he's Darth Vader. And we had a whole role play scenario. And it was the funniest thing. He was a terrible Darth Vader, but he was a great cosplaying Darth Vader. He was someone so overacting and telling me all of his motivations. Oh, Luke Skywalker, he reminds me of my youth and the day. It was so funny. But anyway, I could see an entire game, and of course, making that into a tabletop game, because if you had an app driven, which I know are very, slowly becoming more popular now. But if you had, and by the way, Tales of the Arthurian Knights is not app driven. It definitely comes with a book, but we will probably have an app that you can use instead of the book. But I could definitely see an app driven game in the future where AI characters exist and take you somewhere that the designer never saw. And because the designer's job was to give all the motivations to that character. And then when someone meets them, that character's given free reign within those parameters to make the game happen. And so I see that emergent storytelling and less, because when you get rid of the script as a designer, one of the reasons why it's taking me so long to do Arthurian Nights is because I can't control what the players are going to experience. So I have to account for some of the possibilities so that things don't go off the rails. But in Tales of the Arthurian Nights, there are 400 different starting points for an adventure. And so there are thousands of possibilities of where you can go. So I have to keep, now as I'm editing, I have to make sure that all that stuff can happen. I could meet this character can die. Is there a token that I get so that I know that if I meet this character who's dead, something happens and someone acknowledges, oh, this person was going to be here, but now they're dead. So like, did you kill them? Like there's one where you could kill someone's father and you might meet up with that character later and the game has to acknowledge, does that character know that you killed his father? Was that character there when you killed his father? So do we go to that paragraph and then this person's going to attack you and so on. So that's why it's taken me so long to work on this game. I didn't work on it for straight 15 years. There were times when I wasn't working on it, but lately, it's been, this is all I'm doing I live in this. I'm kind of like you guys, being the age you are, you're probably fans of SpongeBob SquarePants at one point in your life. My daughters watch it like crazy. There's a famous episode of SpongeBob where he becomes this fancy waiter. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not. And he has to empty his mind of everything but breathing and fine dining. And that's me right now. I breathe and I work on the Arthurian game such that someone will ask me a question about something I should know, and I can't focus on it. But if you ask me what to do if Sir Owain has story token number 13, I can tell you in a second exactly what that means. So I look forward to getting my brain back.
That's awesome. Absolutely wild. Yeah. You're talking about the Chat GPT stuff. It's almost like we're getting closer and closer to a different kind of design, right? Like design to me more like a Dungeons and Dragons, right? You create this system by which players can have infinite experiences. And if you power that with technology that can handle it, it's more about designing this framework than it is designing, like right now you're designing the whole story.
And it doesn't put human designers out of business, because the human designer is like the director of this sort of a game. The human designer will be the person who sets those parameters, but then lets the players go wild. And that's going to be hard, but I don't feel threatened by AI. I see it as a tool that's going to be so much fun, and I hope I can live as long as I can, because as it develops, I'm sure I'm going to come up with more fun things to do with it. But as a designer, I can see a lot of autonomy being removed to some extent in a good way, but maybe that's just because emergent design is something I've always dreamed about and have for a long time, and have wished that even video games and so on had more of it. And I think you're going to just see, it's so new. It's as new as the internet was in 1995. It's so much is happening, and you're going to see some incredible things. And I realize people are worried, and there's good reasons to be worried about things being abused, but I see far more positive than negative coming out of it myself personally.
That's honestly, it gives me optimism, because that's the most exciting utilization or concept for utilization that I've heard of for me. Like
in the gaming space.
Well, in general, it's like, like all these things can be automated or whatever, and all this technology. But that's like a very particular application I understand, and it clicks in like a different way. So I have a two-parter finale question for you. You already have, it's crazy, and we'll do a lot more content on this, I think, because I'm fascinated by this. But you've already played a really important role in tabletop over the past 20 or 30 years, and you're building quite the legacy and quite the story here. So I'd be curious to know, you said live as long as possible. So hopefully that's forever. Hopefully we figure that out.
That's the AI's job, right?
But at the end of the day, what would you love to be known for in the tabletop game, or remembered for in the tabletop gaming industry? And then, let's advance to 2050. And what's one thing you really hope is a reality in tabletop gaming by 2050?
Well, I mean, I guess for the legacy thing, it's kind of what I'm in the middle of doing now, and that is with the storytelling. And that is I've always wanted to have stories in my game. I've always been a top-down designer, meaning I usually start with the theme and then work on mechanisms around that. With a couple of exceptions, like Canterbury was much more abstract game. But most of my games have started with the theme, and then I've tried to work the rules around it. So as I'm moving more and more into the storytelling element of it, that's what I would love to be known for, is maybe starting with this game that I'm working on and other games I'll be working on in the future, being able to help usher in that next phase of storytelling games, because it's already begun. I didn't start it, but to be able to help guide it, shepherd it in that direction, so that people remember some of those games and say, oh yeah, with this, that, and the other game, Parks helped bring this game about, one day, that kind of thing. So that's what I would like to be known for. And I haven't had as many opportunities to do that, but that's really what I hope all of my future games are going to be focused on, is bringing out not only storytelling, but emergent storytelling, not scenario based, but one where I buy a game and I can play it 1,000 times without having to I could buy an expansion if I want to add something, but I don't need to buy it in order to just play the game without repeating the same scenario again. Regarding 2050, I guess I would have to kind of go back to what we're talking about with the AI, and that is that that the designers are always going to have their very important role, but that they will be empowered so that fewer gatekeeping is involved, so that designers won't be, one of the things that you hear about AI now is the democratization of certain things. And I hope more and more it becomes possible for people to have a dream, learn how to use the tools, and be able to do it and market it in such a way that I'm not saying publishers are going to go away, and you'll always have those big publishers. I think people were trying to say Kickstarter was the death of the big publisher. We learned that didn't happen, nor should it. I think you'll always have your big publishers. You'll have your big AAA titles. But I think that the ability of people to create something and have someone find it, we're already seeing it, with things like Xbox and so on, where you can see someone's game that's put up there, or apps. I think you're going to see more of that, and you're going to see it easier for people to lean into. And then on top of that, not only will new designers have fewer hoops to jump through, but also there will be that sort of creativity that allows a person to create something that they're not fully in control of, and yet which can still be guided enough that it doesn't become a mess. You don't want the game to be like, hey, look, it's run by an AI and I got killed in the first encounter. You want the game you still want that director to help guide you to where you want to go, and yet let people be able to meet up with things that you weren't anticipating. I think one example of that, I guess sort of an infamous example, I'm a huge fan of the company BioWare, and they're known, of course, for their storytelling games. And they had this sort of disastrous rollout of Mass Effect 3 that you may be familiar with. And Mass Effect 3 had one ending. In spite of all of the different stories that you could go through, Mass Effect 1, Mass Effect 2, it came out with one ending, and people were really upset. Maybe it was two endings. I don't know. I heard it was one. I've still not played Mass Effect 3. Loved Mass Effect 2. It was my favorite video game of all time. And they then went out and put out different endings for it afterwards. But I think that mindset of we need to bring it together, everyone, back to the place where we always intended it to be as designers, is going to go away. And this is going to be your game space now. And it's going to get to these crazy places. And your job as the human is to make sure that it gets somewhere meaningful. Even if I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, I can cater that experience to some extent so that I know it's going to be satisfying. And that's going to be really hard to do. And it's going to require a human being to do.
Incredible stuff, Andrew. I look forward to your vision coming to life and hearing more about the emergent storytelling of Andrew Parks over the next 20, 30 years as we continue to move in this industry. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It really means a lot to us.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
thank you for Nightmare Before Christmas TCG. It's given us so many good memories, and a lot of people on the stream, I think, would agree with that.
Thanks for spreading the word about it too.
Yeah, and final thing, if people are interested in learning more about you, your story, your games, where should they look?
Well, they can go to quixoticgames.com to see it. We have the list of all the games that we've ever published on there. And then we have a Facebook page where we try to keep things up to date as well. And there's a link to it right on quixoticgames.com. And so as we get closer and closer to Arthurian Nights coming out, I can't give you a date for that yet. We're still putting some finishing touches on it, as I discussed. But as that gets closer, we'll be revealing things there. Just as whenever Wizkids approves something, I'm gonna help them promote it.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for being on here. It's a total privilege, and I look forward to grabbing a coffee or a drink at some point from you in the future and asking a lot more questions.
That sounds great, guys. Thank you so much.